Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the panel on Moneyball and its role in the enterprise. My name is David Levin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what I think is going to be a fantastic panel. It's, my co-panelists here have been preparing extensively. And just by way of introduction, you know, the subject here, of course, is that in 1971, the American Society of Baseball started to collect data, and that led to the movie that this panel is named after in 2003. So that's the sort of context and the performance of the Oakland A's at that amazing time. That's why they chose a Brit, by the way, too, or a Zimbabwean, actually, to chair this. If it was cricket, I'd understand it better. But the core concept being that could we pick from data that wasn't available and see different results? So to discuss this with me from left to right, or right to left as you're looking at us, we have Laura Gomez on the far side from Atypica. We have Guy Berger from LinkedIn. We have Guru Sethupathi from Capital One. We have Emily Glassberg-Sands from Coursera. And immediately on my left, we have Kevin Parker, who's the CEO of HireVue. The range of titles of people on this panel are CEO and chairman. We have 3 PhD economists, so please don't be too depressed, all from the East Coast. And we've got 2 people whose whole job is data and analytics. That's the kind of context for our conversation. So let me kick it off, actually, by Guru asking you a little question. You know, a typical baseball squad is, what, 25? And under your wing at Capital One are somewhat 50,000 souls. Mm-hmm. Do you want to set up the question that we're really asking here for us?
I wouldn't say they're under my wing, but yeah, we have 50,000 people at Capital One. It's funny, when I talk to people who don't know much about this space, I actually use the term, hey, do you know what Moneyball is? That's what I do for Capital One, and people get it right away. But with a sophisticated audience, I think it's actually worthwhile understanding what those differences are. And even though it looks like I have a much larger population and a larger data set, I would like to argue actually our job is harder than the job that Paul DiPotesta had for the Oakland Athletics. I think the one commonality is that we're both trying to change fundamentally using data and analytics the culture in organizations around how to think about talent, which is a hard kind of boulder to push. And so there's a lot of commonality in terms of how do you change that culture, how do you influence, how do you story tell, how do you make it about more than just the data to change people who've been in that field for such a long time and how they think about it. But once you move past that, I think there's a couple of key differences that are worth kind of diving into. One is it's actually really hard to measure performance of people in a corporate setting compared to a baseball setting. I think we all get that intuitively. It's not just about runs, it's not just about RBIs and so on and so forth. And so that's one thing that's really, really tricky and that we're trying to solve for every day. The other thing, which may be surprising given the numbers David just mentioned, is the size of the data actually. And it's not the number of observations. Yeah, we have more number of observations perhaps, but the frequency of observations, which matters a lot for a lot of the questions we're trying to answer. Baseball has a game every day, multiple at-bats a day, and it has over 100 years of history of a sport. And so we're dealing with much different level of frequency of data on individuals. A couple others that I'll mention, and we can always kind of dive into these at any point. One is the type of questions we're getting at. Like there are questions my team is trying to work on with regards to promotion, skill development, internal mobility that just don't really apply as much in the baseball context. I think it's much more narrow what they're going after there. Hey, do we go after certain candidates based on their performance, and when do we get rid of them based on their performance, and how does that compare to their salaries? Right? It's pretty simple if you think about the type of questions they're going after. And then the fourth thing, which I'll say is, and any baseball aficionados feel free to debate me on this, is the rate of skill change in the population at Capital One and other organizations is just much more rapid than I would argue compared to how quickly a baseball player needs to upskill due to technological change or rule change or anything like that. So that's another thing where we just have to be on our toes, be very strategic and thoughtful about what we're going after and what questions we're going after. So At the very high level, again, it's a really important common thread about how do you disrupt a field using data and analytics. But after that, I think it diverges.
Fantastic. So Guru, with that slightly more comprehensive view for us all to sort of pick up, I'd like to, Laura, invite you to think about and share with us what observations you've had, and tell us maybe a little bit about your story of why it is that you're doing what you're doing, but what does that mean for us in terms of observing change?
I think to echo Guru's observations, I think when you're employing people, analytics, and employing a lot of those data-driven methodologies to talent, it has so many ramifications. In diversity and inclusion, it's not just the goal, but it could be, for example, there's a big company out there that decided to do sort of an analysis of their wage gap, but then decided to exclude 11% of their workforce. Whether they thought it was too small, whether there was enough statistically significant, I don't know their methodologies, but I think it's important that decision of excluding 11% of your workforce around the wage gap, it's actually can have either legal or cultural ramifications. And so I think it's really important to understand that while in baseball, like you may lose a game, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, you're really not only contributed to the overall corporate responsibility, morale, or even attraction of talent. And so I think with data and with people analytics, I think it's much more, have much more at stake. And I think with where I've seen with our clients is to take data-driven approaches, but really not run with it, but rather analyze first as a baseline of what's happening, especially around such a, not as sensitive, but as such a hot topic as diversity and inclusion.
Great. Thank you. And Guy, I mean, you know, a number of us will have seen your regular updates on the sort of wider world and the huge data set that you survey through LinkedIn. When you look at this data, what would the first things that you share with us be about the risks or the opportunities implicit in data at this scale?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is I think we're able to all of a sudden answer a lot of questions we weren't able to answer 5, 10, certainly 20, 30 years ago. And that's an amazing opportunity either because the data is in some sense much richer through these various sources, or alternatively because computational power has improved so much. And I think sometimes that can actually breed some false confidence, so to speak. You have this amazing new weapon, talent analytics, and that may lead you to perhaps skimp on what used to matter along the past, which is having a good framework for analyzing these problems. I think data can breed a lot of false confidence that things you see in the data, you understand them, but in fact you don't have a good understanding of the underlying process that's generating that data. And I think that becomes, if you want to make good decisions with data and not just come up with fancy analytical ways of analyzing data, then I think understanding what you're analyzing is just as important as the analytical weapons you bring to bear. And I think that's one thing that's always important to remember in this space is what is the data actually telling you about the real world?
Right. So, Kevin, you on the other side of this platform here have rolled out a huge transformation in the way people are being recruited with interviews by video at massive scale. What are you seeing in these first waves of adoption that's behavior changing and that's insightful to allowing us to pick winners?
That's a great question. And maybe I'd bring that back a little bit to the Moneyball analogy too, because one of the breakthroughs I think that the Oakland A's had is letting go of all the data they had and sort of getting past this illusion of validity that the data they were tracking was actually predicting something, and it wasn't. And I think we feel the same way, and our customers feel the same way about all of the things that we've been doing for hiring, resumes in particular, GPAs, things like that we were using to filter out talent, and those actually weren't correlated to success within the organization. And so by using technology, you can open the funnel much wider, get a better sense of who the candidate is, and letting go of this illusion of validity around CVs or resumes in particular. They're not a very good predictor of success. And that, I think, is the big breakthrough that our customers are seeing, don't rely on the old way of doing things because it actually didn't work. And we've just been repeating that unsuccessful way for a very long time. Think differently, reimagine the process.
Great. So go, yes, sir.
So it's interesting to hear you speak in the recruiting context, because if you think about, so an organization's productivity, recruiting plays a huge role, but more than the flow of new folks coming in, the determinants of near-term success are the stock you have today, the people you have today. And so there are some signals, and I'm really excited about the better signals that you're bringing in the recruiting space. I think there's also room to improve the information that you have about your own workforce, or that your customers have about their workforce. And so, one of the things we're working on at Coursera is helping companies understand their internal talent. So what skills do you need to be successful in a particular role for each individual? What skills do they have today? And what's the shortest path from where they are to filling the potential opening? And Guru, you talked a little bit about how sparse the data can be. And that's absolutely true if you look at a single organization. And I think the power of a platform, whether it's LinkedIn or a learning platform like Coursera, is the opportunity to aggregate data across industries, across geos, and start to glean insights on the talent profile that really matters. So what's the difference between a back-end software engineer and a machine learning engineer?
And so Emily, as you look at it, and as you're tracking thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people through the program, with we said about a 6 to 7% aggregate completion rate, and from free to paid, getting it through. How quickly can you spot winners, and are you actually now able to determine a new set of characteristics which says this person early in their trajectory of study is telling me they're going to be a winner?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So our focus has been largely on measuring hard skills.
Yep.
And on identifying where people are going to run into soft skill challenges and fixing that by enabling them to persist through machine learning on the platform, so intervening with behavioral or pedagogical interventions. We have not spent very much energy measuring, or certainly not relaying back to companies, soft skill attributes of individuals like persistence. And there are reasons that you might not want to do that. You might not be super confident in your perspective. And so let me talk quickly about the hard skill and then jump to the soft skill. So on hard skill, we've been focused on building out a skills graph which maps a robust library of skills to the content. So what's the content that teaches them? What are the careers that require them, and what are the learners who have or want to have them? And companies are using that to understand who is potentially well positioned for a new role. Suppose that I'm AXA and I'm looking at my actuaries, and I know that sort of actuarial science is being disrupted by machine learning and AI. And because I'm a company in France, it's very hard to fire people, so I would like to reskill some of my actuaries into more sort of machine learning so that they can build adaptive systems. Well, if I can understand the skill profile of a machine learning engineer, and if I can understand the individual skill profiles of my current actuaries, I can decide who to tap for that opportunity and how to train them. That's our focus. In soft skills, we are trying to predict who's at risk of dropping out of content, and then what intervention will help them persist. And I think that's valuable in terms of, again, using platform data to make the learning experience more effective and more impactful for a world of learners. But feeding it back into the enterprise creates all sorts of interesting challenges, and so far they're not challenges we've tackled.
So Guru, you're receiving all of this enterprise input, and how are you able to handle that?
Yeah. So there's two things I'd like to separate. One, I think there is the formal learning side that Coursera does, and we have a bunch of partners we work with on that side. I'm also interested in kind of informal learning. At this conference, I'm sure you've heard people talk all the time about kind of lifelong learning and kind of growth mindset, and just a lot of that thinking kind of how do you connect that to training providers. But I'm under the firm belief, as hopefully many of you are, that most learning kind of happens on the job for most people, right? And so whether it's kind of the L&D part of it, where you're actually going and taking courses and content, or the other side, which is like, is it the people that are around you? Is it your manager? Is it the type of role and the type of work and the type of opportunity? What actually matters for kind of skill development, career trajectory and all those sorts of things is also something I want to kind of get into. And again, these are the challenges. I'll be honest, I don't know if we're going to actually make a big dent in this. This is really hard to measure some of this stuff. You have to be very hypothesis driven and kind of go deep in some areas and just let other areas go. So again, it's a very different track than just throwing a bunch of big data at the board and seeing what sticks. You have to be very thoughtful, strategic, and hypothesis driven. We'll see where we go, but it's kind of the yin of the yang of Coursera.
Guy, you're nodding on that one. What would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was something Emily said that I thought was really interesting, and I'll give an example. So we, I sort of approach it at LinkedIn as LinkedIn's economist, very much from, less of a talent analytics lens and more of an economics lens. What can we say not just about our business, but about the real world? And one thing, for example, that falls out of this is when we look at our skills data, very much in the same way that Emily talked about how they look at it. We see that a lot of the biggest gaps actually come in this soft skills space. And I think that's really interesting because you sometimes hear that from employers that they have trouble hiring people with all sorts of soft skills. How do you actually teach those things? Are some of these things actually teachable in some way? If you can teach them, is it like, you're not gonna, you might be able to do like a Toastmasters type thing, but like, how do you teach somebody to communicate better, to have better interpersonal skills? These are things that we haven't really traditionally thought about very much in education, I suspect, in general. Our educational system is about teaching somebody something. And these are not so much what's, but rather how's. And I think that is sort of one of the big things that this space is gradually going to explore is, maybe we can teach somebody how to learn Python or, how to, if they're an actuary, run a machine learning algorithm, but how do you teach somebody like the skills that potentially really matter to their employer?
And I think it's really interesting. On a second there. So Kevin, you've got training videos, training people on core communication skills and on interacting with people around them, which is the classic sort of soft skills arena. How differently do people perform once they've been trained?
What we've actually taught people is to become more comfortable with the platform and to recognize that by taking a video interview that's on demand, they've given themselves some freedom to apply for a job that put all the logistical and timing challenges to the side. But it's really more about being comfortable with who they are and sort of engaging with them. We also can track through the course of an interview, and our average interview is maybe 25, 30 minutes long. You can sort of see the candidate become more comfortable. So the first question is generally, tell me a little bit about yourself. And so by the time they get into that and get 2 or 3 minutes, and particularly if companies are making it engaging that have a great questioner or a great sort of setup, you can see the candidate really become very, very comfortable. And we track the Net Promoter Score for all of our interviews and for all of our candidates. And we know our average Net Promoter Score is about 70, so we know candidates are engaged. They take the interview, generally completed in about 24 hours after they've been invited, so they're responding very quickly. But if I, just anecdotally, if I gave you access to this enormous database of interviews and told you, watch any 5 or 10 with the sound off, what you'd see by the end of most often is people smiling. They're talking about themselves, they're having a great experience, they're interviewing for a job. So our focus is to get them more comfortable telling their own story.
We've not really gone into the subject of sort of the use of algorithms to sort of bring in decision making, and I'm going to invite, I guess, Laura to kick off on that subject, because we've got people beginning to say we've got algorithmic decision making arriving. So first of all, we've got the question of data, and then the second layer of that is how much of that can we automate?
Let's take the example, and I'll just go the example of Facebook and at the hearings, and this is congressional hearings saying, yes, AI will take care of what happened in 2016. And I think to really try to make sure that AI will be the solve-all when the humans creating that are the same, have the same mentality, the same thought process that they did when they created whatever 5, 10 years ago. And I think it's really important. As I was hearing everyone, and Kevin especially, I was thinking about all of the different biases in just videos and who gets more comfortable over time. Let's say I'm returning to the workforce after an extended period of time for whatever reason, whether for my children or my parents are aging, and then I come back, how fast am I going to learn these soft skills, or how comfortable am I going to be? And all of these are things that we need to think about. With AI specifically, I think inclusive AI And who's creating the AI from the training sets all the way to the outputs? Like, for us, we're big proponents of like coaching networks. How can we coach our clients to use their data in a way that's empathetic, in a way that's useful for them, rather than penalize them, or rather than create tools that they will replicate the pattern matching, but now at a faster, automated way.
Right.
So I think it's really important to think. Yesterday, the UK Parliament actually came out with recommendations around ethics, around AI. And I think that this is something that we should definitely start following and we should start thinking about.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, as it relates to specifically the workforce, I think anything that we use in tech and in talent and education, those are the things that are really impacting in such a magnifying way, and we don't understand really what we're doing yet.
So you've had some really interesting examples of diving into company data and finding surprises.
Yes.
Are you able to share any of those surprises with us?
I think a lot, to your point, there's a lot of data exhaustion. And I think people are really excited to like get into the diversity and inclusion, and then it becomes into a selective bias. They're like, can we just focus on one end? As much as we've tried to be like, wait, look, here we did a whole statistically significant, and this is where you should focus, the selective bias comes in. And so I think it's really important that we've seen people really make a progress on gender equity at the expense of racial inequalities. And that is not just one client, it's across industries, and that is very concerning. So we really need to understand like how are leaders taking this data and taking that selective bias to just focus on one, and what does that do to the other systematic and structural inequalities that people of color or older, ageism is a thing. So I think that it's really important to work with our clients to not just focus on one part of diversity and inclusion.
Anybody else want to comment on the origin of algorithms?
Well, I think there was something that Laura said that really stuck out to me. And this isn't specifically about algorithms, but I think highlights sort of the nature of the challenge. I don't know how many people here have heard of ban the box, but it is a policy that was approved by many states and was very popular that basically prohibits employers early in the interview process from asking somebody whether they have a criminal record. Very well intentioned, because I think obviously one way to reduce recidivism in former criminals that are released from detention is to ensure they integrate back into the workplace. And so again, I think it's something that we would all think is a good idea. What happened when it was instituted is it apparently solved that problem, but at the cost of significantly exacerbating an even worse problem, which is it ended up limiting economic opportunities for certain minority males without a high school degree. And that was potentially even more devastating. And this isn't specifically an algorithm, but it's a way to highlight that I think a lot of these cases, you want to think about all the biases and all the costs holistically. And you can't just focus on one, because they all involve this. I mean, you want to make progress toward all of them, but they involve trade-offs to some extent. And if you focus exclusively on gender, which, in some I don't know if it's in some sense there's some element of affinity, because it probably is that we interact with a lot more people of a certain gender with high degrees. We might not necessarily include people that have less education because they're not in our peer group. Maybe if we're not a racially inclusive place, then we might not focus on that. And I think that these are all these problems matter. Without saying which one matters more, I think that you need to tackle them simultaneously, or I think you might end up ignoring them while thinking you're solving the problem of inclusion and diversity.
Now we might, just listening to this, begin to feel that it's all a bit gloomy, right? So and it's not.
No.
So I mean, let's have some counterpoints on things which you're feeling.
So there's no one-armed economist. They're all two, on the one hand, on the other hand.
Yeah.
I mean, if we have three economists on the panel, so
all in the middle of the.
All in the middle. So I think one of the things that Guy was alluding to was statistical discrimination. And going back to Gary Becker, Chicago, labor economist, he sort of built a taxonomy of bias or discrimination. So why an employer, in this case, might favor one group over another group. And in particular, he distinguished between taste-based discrimination, which is having an inherent preference for working with one group, either as an employer or because you think your customers will prefer it, or because you think the others in, whatever, in this case, in the workforce will prefer it, versus statistical discrimination, where you're really just trying to find the most productive worker for the job, no matter their gender, no matter their race, but you have imperfect information. And so you pick up on these proxies like, are they female versus male? Do they have a high school degree? If not, they're higher risk of having been in jail. And so one of the things that data can solve is actually improving that information. And it can both lead to less biased understanding of somebody's quality or likely productivity on the job, as well as less noise in so if someone's been out of the workforce for 3 years and you have very little information about them, they could be either a total rock star or not, but they're higher variance than someone who has had a consistent career trajectory. And so I'm really excited actually about the power of algorithms with the right input data and the right output humans interpreting them to reduce imperfect information and to reduce, therefore, these sort of heuristics and statistical discrimination. Because I inherently believe that at most of our companies and most of the companies we work with, the biases that are creeping in are statistical. They're not taste-based. There's no preference for one group over another. It really is an information challenge. And so, if you take that AXA example, can I the AXA example?
Okay, yeah. Use it.
Suppose you were looking at a bunch of actuaries and trying to decide who should be promoted to this higher paying, higher prestige machine learning engineering role. I went to high school with Jeremy Rudy, who's in the audience. That's amazing. We're from Bozeman, Montana. It's wild. Good to see you. So imagine that you were looking at these people. Who would you choose, right? And in the absence of data on their skill profile or the skill profile required to be an effective machine learning engineer, you might go for whoever raised their hand or whoever was loudest in the room or whoever took credit or whoever had a boss with a lot of social capital or whoever went to beers with you the night before. And I think there's less opportunity for that to creep in the more data-driven we are in our people decision-making.
Not agreement to the end.
I'm sorry. I think it's important to know that even with the amount of data that people have, with this, we made, you can go to our Medium post, we looked at data engineers, and we looked at women and men for a specific unicorn company, and we looked at all of this, and we said whatever the outcomes are. The assessment was the same, about 88 median skills in the resume. Women statistically had 10 to 12% more graduate degrees, yet at the application review were reviewed. So they had the data, they had all the data, and I think at the end of the data is again, as I go back, it's where it works. I don't think it's statistical, probability that they don't find a black engineer that has Python. It's the fact that there were 20 other white engineers who they think that was much more.
Coming back on that.
One thing I'll just add, just to play a bit on the gloomy side, is at the end of the day, data just describes the state of our world, right? And so whatever things that are not working well in our world is what we're going to see in the data. And so we just need to be cautious about how we what questions are we asking? What is that data telling us? And one of the things I'm working on in my company is how do we upskill the people who we're showing this data to? Now, fortunately at Capital One, it's a really strong analytical culture and skill set. But even within HR, there are people, who we need to upskill and just say, how do you interpret this data? How do you ask the right questions? And how do you also build a culture of where you can run experiments and counterfactuals, right? So if you want to ask a question of, do we need bachelor's degrees to actually, do you need candidates with bachelor's degrees to do X job, right? Which is quite common in our country, right? It's the bachelor's degree is required for a vast number of jobs, and it's not clear it's actually necessary. But I can't actually test that with the data. I have almost no candidates in the exempt population at Capital One that don't come in. And so are you willing to test and run pilots and try different things and then use data on top of that? For some jobs, yeah, you don't need it.
But the answer is also through the interviewing process, and one of our customers has picked up on that, and rather than looking at a CV and sort of saying, look, you can code, you can't, let's issue a coding challenge to people. Let's issue it very, very broadly. Let's open the funnel very quickly. And if you can do the work, I am interested in talking to you. I don't care if you went to San Diego Community College or MIT. Exactly. So how do you open the funnel and make sure that we're really testing things that are objective measures of skills?
Kevin, I like that. I think it's easier in the tech space, and then it gets a little bit harder as you move away from tech and you go into other areas.
Completely agree. And so as you think about the doom and gloom around algorithms, I'd posit another point of view is that what we're doing without them is awful. The process of interviewing people, the process is incredibly inconsistent. And even, I think I'm a great interviewer, maybe one day a week.
Too.
right? And so, at least if we can work on the science, work on the arithmetic and the statistics, take as much out of it as we can and neutralize it for gender bias, race bias, before we, sort of set it out to, at least in our case, talking to people or interviewing people, you have measurable improvements in diversity as a result of that, and you've got consistency.
Can I just layer on one fact that I find just incredibly powerful about Kevin's point about just our labor markets becoming more meritocratic over the years before, and then now hopefully with algorithms. So if you go back to the 60s and look at kind of who was in the labor force and what kind of jobs there were compared to today and how people are matched to jobs, some economists have looked at the gains from better meritocracy in our labor market and all the things that have happened, all the technological things, computer, internet, like everything you can think of. 25% of our increase in standard of living since then is because of a better meritocracy in our labor market, and people being in the right jobs. Like 94% of doctors were white males in 1960. Probably not the most efficient allocation of labor, and so moving towards a better allocation of labor is just incredibly important, not just from a social justice standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. Right. And to that end, I think so many people are passionate about this.
Sorry, Guy, you wanted to?
Yeah, I thought I thought the interchange between Emily and Laura was really interesting. I think one thing that I agree with Laura that actually that the, let's call it taste-based discrimination is actually a really significant part of remaining inequities in the labor market. And I think one of the things people struggle with, particularly people that are well-intentioned, is they've clawed back a lot at what they think are the economic asymmetric information, missing information part of it, and they're suddenly encountering this tougher nut to crack. A lot of which, again, is potentially well-intentioned people that are not really aware of the biases they have. For people but there's still a lot of the let's call it the missing information part that remains to be cleared away. And the one nice thing about it, which ideally potentially also applies to some of what we classify as taste-based discrimination, is one of the, as we discovered for example from Speaker Boehner, joining a hemp startup, one of the biggest motives for enacting positive change is the profit motive. And I'm not some sort of free market idealist, but I think it is a worthy free market utopian rather is what I mean. But I do think it's one of those things where we can harness these incentives for somebody to say, you might actually, I'd like to think that you really care about this, but even if you don't, this can actually make your business run a lot better. That can move the meter in a pretty large way if applied intelligently. And so even if the taste-based discrimination problem remains pretty significant, is a hard nut to crack, there's still room to move on the other type of discrimination.
Can I ask you guys a question actually on this point actually? How do you differentiate between subconscious bias and taste-based discrimination versus statistical discrimination, right? Because at that point it kind of gets blurry and you don't know which one is which, and how do you solve for either of those?
So let's not worry about the identification problem because that's a hard one to figure out. What I would say is just purely conceptually, taste-based discrimination is something where, from a classical economics point of view, which might not be the correct approach, it's something where if you start wiping that away, you start making some people's lives consciously potentially worse.
So going back to your point really quick about this is good for the business. I've had those conversations. This is great for the business. There's enough data out there about female CEOs and C-suite gender diversity as well, to a lesser extent racial diversity, and we see it. But if we take the example of Starbucks, and we take the example of did they decide to then roll out unconscious bias if that video hadn't been taken? And if anyone, you guys can Google it. I think that, and at that point you say, this is not due to random chance anymore. I mean, everyone who, especially Black, decided, yeah, that happens all the time, and the rest of us, we were in shock, and now it's affecting a business. So I don't know with diversity and inclusion, it's one of those things that I always tackle with, that my intentions are good, that to not have anyone reach that point where they feel threatened by consumers, by their clients, to actually take upon whatever way that they're discriminating. Unfortunately, we've gotten to the point where now it's a lot of the accountability of their employees. Employees are demanding accountability from their leaders, consumers, clients. And so I think that's where the business value is going to be moving forward, diversity and inclusion.
So opening the funnel, increasing the talent. Sorry, Emily, you wanting to?
Well, it's just, it's interesting that we're back to talking about the economics and the cost side of the house, because I think that's where Moneyball originally arose. Like, if you think about Billy Beane when he first started working with the A's, and I don't know much about baseball, but like in 88 and 89 and 90, they made it to the series. They were spending a ton on their heads. I think their spend was like 20 million in 1990 just on their people, and then it grew 70% year over year, and they were spending 34 million in 1991, which was like astronomical for the time. And then they changed ownership, and they had to cut their costs, and they had to find high quality, high performing people who didn't look so damn obvious on paper. And if you think about some of the companies that we have today, and Netflix is an example, who can dish out a lot of cash for a data scientist who's a couple years out of school. They don't necessarily have to look for the diamonds in the rough, but there are a lot of other organizations who do. And looking for diamonds in the rough, or looking for people who don't inherently look good on paper, or didn't go to top schools, or haven't worked at a top company before, requires having good data, because those traditional signals aren't there. So you need other signals of soft skills, you need other signals of hard skills. And I think there is sort of this economic imperative that not all companies face. There are cases where you can just cream skim the top 0.1%. But for most of the labor market, to be competitive and have the right talent, you have to be finding diamonds in the rough.
So the process of recruiting, of course, is not new, right? And we've had there's a lot of data on best and worst methods of recruiting. So we've seen that there's statistical evidence saying one-on-one interviews are kind of a random walk. It sort of could go either way. What's the way that you can combine AI and data with the best that we know about great recruiting, which actually will measure all of those other skills: grit, persistence, team working? These are all things which can be identified in recruiting. And what are the examples that you've seen of how people can bring these together?
So one of the things that, and this is sort of right at the center of our target, if you will, we're looking at all of those capabilities, and with our IO Psych team and our data science team, building the questions and assessing that, and then correlating that to performance inside the organization. So we'll take a data set and say, look, bank tellers are a great example. We probably interview globally 2,000 bank tellers a week. And so there's a skill set, there's capabilities, there's customer centricity, empathy, a variety of skills. And then we can correlate those models to performance inside the company, and then neutralize them for gender differences, racial differences, and things like that. And the advantage of that from a candidate perspective is you're taking this interview, and we know almost in real time where you fit on that spectrum. And so rather than taking this funnel, which has traditionally been a first in, first out process, we can create swim lanes in the candidate population and really respond very quickly and say, you took an interview in Peoria last night and you're a great big bank teller candidate. I'm going to reach out to you tomorrow morning and schedule an interview. And the fundamental tension today is that it takes so long for companies to get an offer out to somebody, 40, 50, 60 days. The best talent is off the market in 10 days. And so you've got a candidate pool, particularly in today's tight labor market, where candidates are responding very quickly. As one customer said to me, I don't think I'm getting the best talent. I think I'm getting the best talent that will sit through my extended process and be there at the end. And all the good people have probably left.
So I can see Laura's nodding, but one of the questions that she surfaced was ethics. And so when you've got predictive analytics beginning to creep into the system, which says, early on in the system, I'm spotting that you're good at X. How confident are we that our system is rigorous, robust, transparent enough that we're willing to let that out in the wild? And what are the unforeseen consequences that can come from that?
Well, from our perspective, we do a lot of confirmation with customers. We start to measure outcomes, and we can see diversity improve, we can see retention improve, we can see customer satisfaction improve. One of our customers, we're doing some of those algorithms, we were sort of classifying things into 3 different buckets, actually did a very deliberate exercise and started with the bottom third and started interviewing those people in person. And about 95% of those people did not make it past the first in-person interview. So we're trying to get the candidates responded to and create a very candidate-centric process that helps companies respond very quickly and puts people in the right category.
So one of the things you're picking up there is that the workflow of recruiting right now is itself, separate that from the data and the quality of the assessment, the actual work process is pretty primitive. And one of the benefits here is by tightening the process, by making it more slick, and in a funny way, using technology to make it more human. I respond to you quicker. It gives you a better outcome.
It does. It
Right.
does.
Guy, you've got in your data set a structural distinction between, let's say, the community in LinkedIn, although it's vast, is probably slightly biased towards better educated, better paid kind of jobs. And how do you think, when you're trying to extend these sorts of systems and the use of data and analytics, what's the level at which we should be pitching the systems? Is this something that we should be thinking about is the best way of assessing entry-level skills-based jobs, or is it going to play all the way through the job ladder?
So my general feeling is with enough tweaks, the system can work everywhere. But I think it is important to generally. I tend to be an empiricist in the sense that you try things, you see if they work, and if they seem to be, you ideally have some sort of external benchmark you're comparing it to, and if it seems like it's converging toward what you're trying to achieve in out-of-sample tests. Sorry, I'm talking like an econometrician here, but if it heads toward whatever objectives you're trying to hit or whatever benchmark you're trying to hit, then you're probably on the right track, even if what you're starting with is imperfect. And alternatively, if you have what you think is the best data set, the most comprehensive data set, and what you've created is consistently missing the mark, then it's time to go back and revisit what you thought your priors were about how to push a problem. And I think that's the same thing here, which is, if you're trying to analyze some group and you only have a fraction of it, and maybe your prior is that you're, within that group, there's a subgroup that you're undercounting, another group that you're overcounting. You can try to adjust for that and see how it works. And if you are kind of hitting the mark, you can try to converge in one way. And if you're totally missing the mark, then you conclude, I can't analyze these groups jointly. I need to separate them.
But is this, as we're rolling this out, the overwhelming number of jobs that you're doing through this, Kevin, are, let me call it, entry and first level jobs. How far and how fast do you think it's going to extend up the system? Or how quickly will it go?
Very quickly. I don't, there's a cutoff point. I don't know that you're ever going to use this to hire a CEO, but as we think about our customer base, we tend to move from thorny hiring problem to thorny hiring problem. And everything from insurance agents, wealth management people. Yes, there's a lot of entry-level jobs, but when we can find sales is a great example. When we can find a large enough data set to start to model from, and we've got good performance data, we can go up very, very quickly.
Great.
I think the one thing I would just counter a little bit is there's some research that shows as you move up that ladder, there's more idiosyncratic nature to fits of people and companies, right? And so you can take an entry-level population, let's say investment banking analysts, right? They kind of look the same whether you have Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Bank of America, whatever, right? And so you can kind of have a large data set that you can kind of pool and find the right matches. Now you take that kind of 10 years in, 15 years in, and the culture, job fit, all that starts to matter more and more, becomes a bigger part of the actual match, and so that's where it becomes a little bit tricky.
Yeah, completely agree.
So a star is not always a star.
Exactly.
Context is kind of important. Sorry, Guy.
But I think to tie this back to some of Laura's points, I think that the one thing about I would almost say that the one challenge with that is fit actually probably sometimes tends to reinforce a lot of the biases. And so in some sense, you might think, taking the approach where you actually, this is challenging and in the ideal, but I think you can come up with ideas of how actually, in some sense, assuming a certain amount of uniformity, even at higher levels, is one way to actually compensate for the fact that maybe because of residual institutions in the higher levels of the professional work ladder, if you just do things that fully aim for fit, you will misfire on diversity and inclusion. If you actually assume, strip those away and kind of underweight fit, you might actually end up with a better a more representative population. I think it's a challenge to hit the sweet spot.
The tricky thing is fit matters, we know that, but the way we measure fit is very biased. And I think that's the trick and what we're trying to struggle with.
Far too much agreement down this. We're coming towards the end, so we've got 5 minutes left. I've got 2 questions that I'd like everybody to take a pop at, and we'll be a bit more traditional and go down. The first question is, as we raise the question of ethics and structure. We're at 1.0 in AI and data and analytics. We know that in 10 years from now, life is going to be very different. We know there's unforeseen consequences. What are the things that you think all HR departments and all companies should be thinking about to structure the ethical frameworks? Is there a broader set of codes required? Do we need to think more widely about that? That's the first question, and then you've got a minute each. The second half of that question is, what's the sign of the future that is going to tell you that something new is coming, that everybody here should be watching for, that's, wow, this is now real, it's moved up a level? 1 minute each, starting with Laura.
Yeah. I was just thinking on the ethics of AI, especially as it relates to talent and or education. I think it's really important to know what is the output? Like there's, for example, a big company just in their algorithm is ranking people that rejected the company higher, so you can resurface those candidates. But imagine in 10 years saying, I went through that process. Eventually, law is going to catch up with a lot of these algorithms that we're building right now, and we don't know yet. I mean, there's employment lawyers who are looking at AI. They're looking at all of the complexities of all the tools we're employing, and we don't know really what they're going to have in the workforce. So I think really understanding, that's really important. And then the second question?
We'll come back to you. Yeah. Your minute's up. So, Guy, we'll come back if there's time.
Yeah, so what I would tell people in human resources and talent organizations is be aware of everything all the objectives you're trying to drive, because they're going to involve trade-offs. If you ignore some of them, those things might underperform. And you're not going to be able to hit all of them perfectly, and maybe you can hit the sweet spot of what you want to hit in terms of delivering the high performers, making sure there's inclusion, any other objectives that you potentially want to hit to create a good employee experience, et cetera. How we know there's success in the future? So I think right now we think of like the cutting edge of talent analytics being the people here that are in Silicon Valley, et cetera, and maybe financial services too. But I think Guru's kind of on the cutting edge in that industry, and they're probably the ones that are closest to it. I think when we start seeing differentiation within industries, within types of firms, between those that are using these Moneyball approaches and don't, and not just across industries, that's when we know this is starting to make a difference, and not just we're in the pre-Moneyball phase where people are just trying various things and seeing if they work.
I'll be brief. We're on the ethics. I'm having this conversation with my CHRO, and I think there's actually 3 legs to this stool. One is on the benefits side. Is it really the question we want to get after? Really driving business value. Number 2 is what's the cost? Is there any cost from a trust standpoint with our associate population that we have to think about? And then 3 actually is, we're collecting all this data from our associates. Can we make this more palatable to them by actually providing products, data, insights back to them so they feel happy to share this data and they see the benefits of it? And I actually think that's something that can move the lever in this whole trust conversation. On the second point, I think one thing to watch out for to see if this is really taking off is, are HR people becoming savvier about this stuff? You can easily go hire a bunch of data scientists to go build you models, but your HR business partners are the kind of the conduit between that team, my team, and the business partners. Do they understand data? Do they have good judgment? Do they ask the right questions? If you're able to upskill them and invest in that population to get better about how to interpret, hypothesize with this stuff, I think that's a real win.
I think my primary call
45 seconds.
35. My primary call to action for the HR folks is to make sure they understand what's happening under the hood. I think it's very sexy to say you have machine learning happening, but ultimately it's mostly logistic regression, and you should understand what the model is optimizing for and what features it's taking as inputs if you're going to use it to run the business. When I think things are going to change, I think you're on the frontier. I think things are going to change when we have a very broad top of funnel where people are judged on what they know, not who they know or the past credentials that they happen to have had. And that's going to require really strong, powerful, reputable data that allows us to predict someone's productivity on the job independent of their past trajectory.
You've given 7 extra seconds.
7 extra seconds. So, I think maybe I'll answer the two of them together. I think one, iterate quickly and measure, remeasure. Don't assume it's working. Be professionally skeptical about it. And I think we'll know when we're making progress. One of the expressions I hate the worst in this entire conversation is the Rooney Rule, which comes, we'll end on we started with sports, we'll end with sports, I guess, which is, we're going to solve the diversity problem by interviewing at least one woman and one minority for every NFL job. And what a waste of time. That's what you do when you don't have data. And this is an opportunity, I think, we're at the early stages to use data in a very, very positive way that has very positive outcomes.
I couldn't sum up better. I want to please join me in thanking our panel for some really insightful comments. Thank you, guys.